This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and thank you for being with us this morning for realising opportunities in Asia for WA's Medtech and Pharma sector. The City of Perth is very pleased to be partnering with Asialink Business for this event. And it's our absolute pleasure to have all of you that are on the webinar with us. Before I start, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also to the traditional owners of the lands throughout Australia from where you may be watching this presentation. The City of Perth's proud partner of Asialink Business, and we've been working with them for many years. We've had a keen focus on the medical and life sciences industry for the last couple of years. A boundary redistribution in 2016 extended the borders of our local government area to include the QE2 Medical Precinct and also the University of Western Australia's campus. And from that time, we've started to develop a really keen focus on the medical and life sciences sector. I'm here this morning in lieu of one of my colleagues, Michael Pasquale, who was unfortunately unable to be with us, but Michael is our point person for the medical and life sciences sector here at the City. And he's been working very closely with a lot of the stakeholders in that sector for the last couple of years and has been working on some very key projects, including the Team Perth delegations that have gone to Biotech for the last few years, as well as to the Bio Conference in Philadelphia last year. At the City, we also leverage our international relationships, such as our sister city connections, for the benefit of local businesses, including particularly our Medtech sector. Very pleased that you've all able to join us this morning, and I'd now like to pass to Mukund, the CEO of Asialink Business, who will be your moderator for this morning's event. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that very warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. As Steve has introduced me, my name is Mukund Narayanamurthy and I'm the CEO of Asialink Business. I'd like to highlight at the outset that it's been a great pleasure to partner with the City of Perth now over 5 years, delivering insights, capabilities, and connections to major stakeholders, including small and medium-sized businesses, universities, and council-related organizations, including the state government, through our relationship with the City of Perth, which has really brought a sense of leadership on international engagement in Western Australia, and we thank them for that leadership. I'd like to highlight as well for all participants who have joined this session that this session is being recorded, and I also request all of you to please submit your questions to the Q&A button that's available on your screen so that we can refer to them and raise them with the panelists during the in-conversation discussion. I'm delighted that we have three wonderful speakers with us today, in Dr. Dan Grant, Pradeep Philip, and Brownlee Grice, and I will shortly introduce each of them as I invite them to speak. Our first speaker is Dr. Dan Grant, who, as many of you will know, is the CEO of MTP Connect, the federal government's industry growth center for the Medtech and Pharma sector. Dan has spent more than 25 years in senior roles in the pharmaceutical, higher education, and medical research sectors. And prior to joining MTP Connect, Dr. Grant was the inaugural Pro-Vice Chancellor for Industry Engagement at La Trobe University, where he had oversight of the university's innovation, commercialization, and industry engagement activities. He was also the Senior Director and Head of Pfizer's External Research and Development Innovation Group for Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, and the Head of Open Innovation. Dr. Dan Grant will now present on the findings from two reports that MTP Connect and Asialink Business did in partnership with support as well from Austrade, which have focused on frugal innovation in medical devices and technologies in India and on digital health in Indonesia. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Grant.
Thank you, Mukund. I'd like to start by also acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we all reside at the moment, pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also really like to thank Mukund for inviting me to be part of this today. We've had an ongoing relationship with Asialink Business for a number of years, put out a number of what we think are really important publications for the sector, all focusing on how Australia's medtech, biotech, pharmaceutical sector might realize opportunities in Asia. And today we're really going to talk about those two reports. For those of you who don't know MTP Connect, we are the industry growth center for the medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector. And included in that is digital health. We are very much focused on working with all of the key stakeholders within the sector, including companies, researchers, industry associations, governments, universities, and investors. Now, just to apologize, I'm just going to turn a printer off because somebody sent a printer to my office. One of the challenges of working remotely, just bear with me for 2 seconds. Oh, it stopped. I apologize for that background noise. So we're very focused on working with all of the key stakeholders in the sector to help grow Australia's MTP sector. And we do that by really focusing on 4 key objectives. We're working to promote collaboration and commercialization in the sector. We do a lot of work to promote management and workforce skills, including launching a new program that's funded by the Medical Research Future Fund called READY. If you look at our website, you'll see information on that being posted today. We also work very much to optimize the regulatory environment that we work within. And finally, we're very focused on helping organizations access global supply chains and markets. And that's really the focus of the information that I'm going to provide you today. So as Mukund mentioned, we have worked with Asialink Business for a number of years and recently have published 2 reports. And I want to give you the high-level findings from these two reports as they relate to the opportunities for the sector in terms of Asia and Asia business. The first report was published just before Christmas on frugal innovation, and it looks at frugal innovation specifically as it relates to India. And India does represent a unique opportunity for Australian and particularly Western Australia medtech and pharmaceutical companies. So why India? Well, we know that the global demand for medical devices and technologies has never been stronger. The demand's growing faster in developing countries, where hundreds of millions of people are now able to afford healthcare goods and services that until recently were really out of their reach. And as a result, developing countries now represent a growing market for Australian medtech, biotech, and pharma companies. Apologize, I will turn that printer off again. So if we just look at the potential for the developing countries, we can see that developing countries' growth in terms of health spending is increasing about 7.5% per annum. This is about 3 percentage points greater than the global average. We also see that developing countries' share of global GDP is now about 40% in absolute dollar terms of the total global GDP. That's substantially increased since 2020 or 2000. Between 2000 and 2018, that doubled. And if we look specifically at India, we see that the 10-year growth of their per capita GDP has been about 5.5% per year. India is also an interesting market because if you look at the India healthcare sector and the spend in that sector between 2008 and 2017, that spend grew from $60 billion to $213 billion. And it's expected that that will more than double by the year 2022. Medical device imports I should say medical devices are largely imported into India. 80% of their medical devices are imported from overseas. Importantly, those imports are largely the higher end medical devices, and they generally produce their own consumable goods in India. So there is a big market, $213 billion of healthcare spend. Big opportunity to see imports into India, but there is also a challenge, and that challenge is that in India, the per capita spend on medical devices is about $4 per year, and that is substantially less than the global spend, which is $63 per year per capita, and even more striking is the difference between that and the US, where the per capita spend is $500 on medical devices. So while there is a large market, there are often constraints around costs. And so why India? Well, India is a market that is growing, but it's constrained by cost pressures. It favors innovation that minimizes cost while maintaining the quality and functionality in the design of new medical devices, technologies, and services. And I really want to emphasize that the opportunity in India is there, but not at the expense of quality and medical outcomes. So the report that we put out recognized that if Australian companies wanted to capitalize on the India market, one opportunity through what is known as frugal innovation. And frugal innovation does represent a unique opportunity for Australia. Frugal innovation is the creation of new or improved goods, services, or processes at the lowest possible cost, but again, without compromising quality. Cost minimization is achieved by delivering the functions promised without any additional expenditure on optimizing the product. Frugal innovation can be applied beyond the design and manufacturing of goods. Principles of frugal innovation are also used in the design and delivery of services and to the simplification of business models. And an example in India is Nararian Health, who in essence produced a production line approach to cardiac surgery. They were able to cut the cost by 70% and open up cardiac surgery to a much larger part of the market. The characteristics of frugal innovation generally revolve around four things. They revolve around increasing portability, so decreasing the size and battery power needed to allow devices and equipment to be used in rural and remote settings. It often features defeaturing, so simplification of a function to reduce the cost and to reduce the level of training needed for clinicians using the devices. Concept of leapfrogging technology, so not waiting for fixed infrastructure to be developed, but utilizing mobile technologies, digital technologies, and again, where digital health really comes into play. And then, of course, the concept of flexibility or service flexibility, where products can actually serve multiple purposes. An example that is highlighted in the report is the use of diesel engines for tractors that can also be used without changing the design of the engine to power backup generators for hospitals. So frugal innovation is an opportunity in the medtech space that Australian companies, Western Australian companies, should look to in order to access Asia. Now I'm conscious of time, so the other report that we've put out is related to digital health in Indonesia and the opportunities that exist in Indonesia for our digital health companies. And again, you only have to look at some of the key statistics to appreciate why Indonesia is an attractive market. With a population of 263 million people, it's a large market. It has a large portion of young people who are very much connected to the internet. 110 million young people with internet penetration of about 65%. There's more than 170 million internet users in Indonesia alone. Their internet economy is huge. It's $54 billion, and it's anticipated that it will reach $174 billion by 2025. Their GDP is about $1.4 trillion. They're the 16th largest economy, and they have a $19.6 billion global investment in health innovation. Right? They also have a substantial digital health industry, with somewhere in the order of $85 million being spent on digital health in 2017. It's estimated that will grow to $973 million by 2022. And again, mobile penetration is very high. So I think with a large population, strong growing economy, and a high spend on digital and health activities, there is an opportunity. Now, I put up this slide because most people won't know what the Australian $20 note has in common with Indonesia. And it's not the fact that Australia prints the 50,000 rupee polymer note for Indonesia, but rather this is a reflection of Australia's history in remote telehealth activities. And so on the $20 note, we have a representation of the Royal Flying Doctors. John Flynn created the Royal Flying Doctors in 1928, and that would only have been possible because of the pedal radio that is shown here, that was developed by Alfred Traeger in 1929, which enabled connecting people to the outback via radio, originally Morse code. And this is sort of the first example of e-health or telehealth. In fact, this other image that you can see on the $20 note, which is in the background, is the body chart that Sister Lucy Garrick developed in 1951 that's still used today to allow patients to describe the region and intensity of pain that patients have during their telehealth consultations with the Royal Flying Doctors. Now, why do I put that up? Well, because although we've depended on the Royal Flying Doctors, and we're depending more on telehealth to make sure that we have equitable access to our health systems and services in our rural and remote communities, Indonesia has the same problem. They have 263 million people, but they're spread across 17,000 islands. And so they're great opportunities for Australian companies to leverage their expertise in developing telehealth, developing rural opportunities, rural and remote opportunities that can be utilized in Indonesia. I was also asked to remind everyone that the Indonesian-Australian Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement has recently been flagged and signed. It will come in effect in July, and this opens up new opportunities in digital health, or overcome some of the challenges that might have existed within Indonesia. This agreement will eliminate the need for data localization within Indonesia, meaning that you no longer have to store your data in Indonesia. And perhaps more importantly, it also eliminates the need for source code to be shared in Indonesia, so that there's no longer the concern over protection of intellectual property. So those two items in terms of this partnership agreement will have a significant impact on digital health opportunities in Indonesia, and I'm sure Mukund will mention more about that later on. So I put this slide up because, again, a large market, 263 million people, a large GDP, $1.3 trillion. But again, there are these challenges. And if you look at the health expenditure per capita in the middle of this slide, you'll see that it is quite low. It's $150 per annum per person, which is a small amount. And again, it flags the need for opportunities to be delivered in a cost-effective way in Asia. So there are opportunities for West Australian companies and for Australian companies to capture market in Indonesia, to leverage opportunities in Indonesia. But I think you do have to focus on some key things. First, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're providing increased access to healthcare. You do have to provide quality, whether it's through digital health applications or through frugal innovation. This is not developing technologies or programs at the expense of quality. You have to address the cost of delivering this in Asia. And again, the per capita spend in many of these countries is quite low. It's a great opportunity to improve the efficiency of healthcare, business models. It's not just about technologies, but it's also about business models and the way healthcare is delivered. And then, of course, great opportunity to improve consumer experience. So I'd like to stop there and really say that we've enjoyed working with Asialink Business in developing these two reports. We realize that there are great opportunities in Asia for Western Australia's medtech, biotech, and pharma sector. We think that that while there are these opportunities, we do need to move fairly quickly to make sure we capture them. I think that there will be a substantial amount of competition to access those markets. And I think we have an opportunity now to really work hard to capture those. With that in mind, I would like to remind everyone that MTP Connect has an office in WA. We have the MTP Connect WA Life Sciences Innovation Hub, and our Director of Stakeholder Engagement, Kate Brooks, resides in Perth, and she would be very happy to help any of the companies who are listening on to this call today in accessing Asian markets. And with that, I'll stop and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dan, for those really wonderful insights covering both the India market opportunity and the Indonesia market opportunity. And I'd like to highlight for all of our participants that the slides that Dan shared were drawn from the two reports, and the two reports are publicly available. They are freely downloadable from both the MTP Connect website and also the Asialink Business website. And so I encourage you to download those reports and review them in detail. They include a number of very detailed and practical case studies, which many of you will find extremely valuable, in addition to building on Dan's comments in highlighting the opportunities for our businesses in both of those markets. For those of you who have just joined us, I'd like to highlight that this session is being recorded. And also, could I request you to please submit your questions to the Q&A button that's available on your screen, which will be really valuable as we move into the in-conversation discussion a little later in this session. I'd now like to invite our next speaker, Bronwyn LeGrice, who is the co-founder, CEO, and managing director of Australia's National Digital Health Initiative, And Health. Bronwyn has over 18 years executive experience in the health technology sector, spanning venture capital, transaction management, capital raising, corporate development, investor relations, and industry advocacy. Formerly an investment director with leading healthcare VC bioscience managers, Bronwyn has managed over $65 million of private and public equity capital raisings and been actively involved in over $30 million of portfolio investments. In 2017, Bronwyn founded And Health, Australia's only dedicated digital health accelerator and commercialization support organization. Now Australia's leading health technology scale-up accelerator, And Health's unique industry-led model has led to significant growth within Australia's nascent digital health sector. Bronwyn, thank you for joining us. I look forward to listening to your insights. Please join me in welcoming Bronwyn.
Thanks, Mukund, and thanks to Asialink Business for having me here today. I'm actually going to share my screen. So everyone should now be able to see the slides that I prepared. And some of my slides overlap with Dan, so I'll probably go off piece a little bit, and I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll keep it quick. Oops, there we go. So just in terms of a bit of context, the reason that I established And Health, so digital health has been one of the fastest growing investment classes globally for over a decade now, with $70 billion invested since 2010 and an average compound annual growth rate of 27% per annum. We were set up due to a need from businesses to access commercialization expertise highly specific to the digital health pathway to market. And we built some custom programs around that, and we've supported over 300 companies in less than 3 years through a various number of programs. In terms of just quickly talking about how we see digital health, it's really important that we go beyond thinking about digital health as connecting points of care and data analytics to ensuring that we also take into account platforms that are a little bit more specific and higher value add in the clinical and commercial evidence space. So we work closely with digital medicine companies and digital therapeutics companies, as well as broader digital health companies. So we do work with companies that require are required to meet therapeutic thresholds analogous to a Class 3 medical device and/or therapeutic. We have a cooperative commercialisation model that is novel globally. We work with a series of financial members across the top who co-fund us along with our government partners, and we work with program partners across the country to deliver certain programs. And we have a highly cooperative model working with a broad range of ecosystem partners and other accelerators that are complementary to our later stage approach. As McCune intimated, we've actually had some very great outcomes, and our 10 cohort companies that we put through our pilot have served over 70,000 patients and created 165 new jobs. But moving on to, I guess, some of the opportunities in the reports, we're here to talk about Asia. We were really fortunate last year in one of our seminal one-day summits to feature the CEO of Halodoc. Clearly an extraordinarily successful business out of Indonesia, raised roughly $100 million last year. And that just really illustrated to us that it's not just about opportunities for us to go to Indonesia, but what can we learn from Indonesia as well. So Halodoc serves 7 million patients per month, and, you know, serves a population of 80% of Indonesia that resides outside the major metropolitan centres. So it's clearly a country where, you know, arguably has been faster to uptake remote healthcare than Australia. And so I think there's a lot of learnings that our companies can learn just by looking at the case studies of those companies, but it also offers a significant opportunity for countries, for our companies to partner with, as well as sell into the Indonesian market. So Dan touched on the data, so I don't want to deep dive into that, but you know, the digital health sector in most countries is growing, and Indonesia is growth is exceptional. Again, Dan and I have some similar slides, so I'll try and talk off the slide per se. Again, I think the large and technology-enabled population is a really interesting piece, specifically within the same time zone for our companies. Trade agreements are really important, especially as we move into a post-COVID environment of looking at quite a strong policy focus on sovereignty and supply chain. But it's not just about having your whole supply chain in Australia, it's about supply chain resilience. And key trading partners with strong economic partnership agreements are key to that domestic supply chain resilience as we move forward. With the Indian opportunity, again, I would reiterate Dan's comments about the average spend per person and how that would translate in a digital healthcare environment. But again, you know, a lot of our digital health companies may have hardware components, so I encourage them to look to the Asian markets for partnerships around contract manufacturing, and also outsourced development partnerships where we can access some extraordinary talent and skills, especially in an environment where people can't necessarily travel to take up a job. There's no reason not to hire your talent globally, especially in the Asian region, just because people can no longer fly. So I would encourage our companies to start to look at the capabilities in Asia that they can leverage and partner with to not only improve their own business, but also to access those Asian markets. I'm just going to jump on to some COVID stuff because, as I said, Dan covered that stuff. So we have done quite a lot of work in gathering global survey data around COVID-19. For digital health, by and large, for many of our companies, it's actually been a positive, which is a somewhat terrible thing to say, but it's certainly shone a light on digital health in Australia. And we've had Greg Hunt say that, he's been able to affect 10 years of regulatory reform in 3 weeks. That's a really key piece of how we build this industry moving forward. But these are some investors, Rock Health, digital health specific investors out of the US. This shows that where they see the growth areas in digital health coming out of the COVID situation. And I think it's really important, going back to Halodoc, how important people now consider telemedicine to be, but also clinical grade remote monitoring, triage tools and digital therapeutics. And one area that I know that Australia and India have collaborated on before, which is clinical trials, and how can we facilitate clinical trials with technology? In terms of in Australia, the biggest challenges we see coming out of COVID-19 will be access to capital. Again, looking to partner markets such as India and Indonesia for capital and novel ways of funding your innovation is a really key thing. And again, using virtual technology to transcend the limitations on international market entry. But we've seen massive opportunities in terms of the destruction of institutionalised inertia across the healthcare system and forced innovation. We're seeing a changing regulatory and reimbursement landscape here in Australia, which offers some significant opportunities for companies. Removal of barriers to adoption in both clinicians and patients and practice management levels. Sector recognition, and the fact that we're all talking about it is definitely a big progression since we started Ant Health 3 years ago. And potential preferential investment opportunities and trade partnerships. So that's just a little bit of a quick summary. As I said, I didn't want to reiterate what Dan said, but I do think that, you know, COVID-19 triggers even more opportunity for us to engage with our ASEAN neighbours in a digital health context. So thank you very much.
Bronwyn, thank you so much for those exceptional insights and for broadening the definition beyond digital health to also include digital therapeutics and digital medicine, and for also highlighting the opportunities that are emanating as a result of COVID-19. So there's a lot there for discussion during the in-conversation. Thank you for those insights. Again, for those of you who have just joined, please note that this webinar is being recorded. I also encourage you to submit your questions to the Q&A button, which will be terrific to refer to as part of the in-conversation very shortly. But next, can I please invite Pradeep Philip, who I'm sure is very well known to many of you, who's a partner with Deloitte Access Economics and has had a long and successful career in public policy with deep expertise in economics and proven leadership experience. As a senior bureaucrat working at the highest levels of public policy across 3 jurisdictions in Australia. As many of you will know, Pradeep has served in the Prime Minister's office, has been a secretary for the Victorian Government's Department of Health and Human Services, been a CEO of the Victorian Government's startup venture agency known as Launchvic, which has a $60 million fund, and has also served as an Associate Director General of the Department of Premier and Cameron in Queensland. So extraordinary experience across 3 jurisdictions in Australia, and now also in professional services as a senior partner with Deloitte Access Economics. I should also highlight that Pradeep is a director of MTP Actuator, which is a leading MTP accelerator with activities in Australia and also across the Asia Pacific. Pradeep will now share his views with us on the state of Australia's engagement with India and what we need to do in order to actually grow that engagement. And then in the in-conversation, we'll also share his views with us on opportunities in Medtech and Pharma. Please join me in welcoming Pradeep.
Thank you very much for that, Mukund, and great to be with all of you here today. So I want to spend a little bit of time providing a bit of the context as we gather here to talk about India. And I want to start with this, that a new world order is emerging. Growth and trade is shifting to the region. Population is shifting to our region. We know that by 2025, 2/3 of the world's population will live on Australia's doorstep. Income growth is occurring in the region. By 2030, 65% of the global middle class will be in our region. This is the Indo-Pacific New World Order that is emerging. Now, India could overtake the US as the second largest economy as a share of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms by 2035. And most up-to-date forecasts have India continue to grow strongly in the medium term. Indeed, if you look at Peter Varghese report, he suggests that the Indian economy will be around 6 to 8% a year growth for the next 20 years. It is set to significantly outpace the global average, and notably outpace China. The IMF has noted that India's GDP growth was about 7.3% in 2018, 7.4% in 2019, and had expected growth to be around 7.7% in 2020. But that's old news now, pre-COVID-19. Indeed, if we just look at the last quarter, India's GDP grew at 3.1% in the period January to March. That is the slowest pace of annual growth in about 11 years. And income growth has slowed. Per capita income in real terms during 2019 2020 grew at around 3.1% compared to 4.8% the previous year. On the demand side, we're seeing the big drivers of the decline in annual growth coming from investment and export. Now, although the market has seen the slower growth, there is some evidence, particularly if you look at India's industrial production over the first 2 months of this year, that suggested that there were green shoots starting to appear in industrial activity. In other words, a large part of the slowdown that we are seeing in India in this quarter may have occurred primarily in the second half of March, which is when COVID-19 started to spread aggressively in India, forcing the government to take the strong action that it has. And we see some more pain coming in the June quarter, which is something that will not be unique to India. But the underlying drivers and shape of India as an economic force is undeniable. India's scale is extraordinary. By 2025, 1/5 of the world's working age population will be Indian. By 2030, there'll be over 850 million internet users in India. But there is a warning in all of this. India is not China, which is the country that people most compare India to. It cannot direct the economy the way China does. Democracy and rule of law differ. But there are also some advantages that this points to. The Indian government has had a big emphasis for a number of years in improving the ease of doing business. And that is significant. If you look at reforms in India, demonetization, trade liberalization, and now health reform, these are really important building blocks for our discussion here today. India has a young population, and as I mentioned before, income growth is significant. So for the most part though, businesses from Australia have viewed India more in terms of being a cost arbitrage proposition rather than for the inherent market qualities that it displays. The wave of reforms in India is significant in 3 ways. The sheer volume. The second, the value of a scale that we can scarcely imagine. And finally, a scope which is not just about infrastructure and open markets, but about services which serve to reduce inequality. This should be the nature of our partnership, particularly for the City of Perth, learning from each other about what works to build sustainable economies, markets, industries, and communities. A long-term relationship, not simply a transactional one. And I might just close with a couple of comments about Western Australia and Perth in particular. You have in Perth the Future Health Research and Innovation Fund currently going through the upper house, repurposing of the 1.2 billion WA Future Fund. That is a good platform. It's probably fair to say there's been limited pharma sector here in Perth. The key question is how to grow it, how to attract the big pharma investment, the big medtech investment, the big digital health investment. And the answer lies in that we have to do more to grow the R&D space and collaboration and commercialization with universities, the broader health and scientific community as a medium-term strategic play. And you have great people like the Chief Scientist, Peter Clinton, and Professor Fiona Wood, who are able to provide great support in this. And I might draw my comments to a close there, Mukund, given time.
Pradeep, thank you so much for those insights. I think it's really important to frame the discussion on India as you've just done so and always do so brilliantly. And I think the very sober reminder of the most recent quarter in terms of the growth forecasts and the challenges that's posing for the Indian economy, which needs to grow at a certain scale and rate in order to meet the needs, the income per capita needs of its population, means that some very significant structural challenges in that economy. So thank you very much for those insights. We now have the opportunity for an in-conversation discussion to really share with each of the panelists your questions. There are a few questions that have come in. If I could request all of you that are participating to please submit questions to the Q&A button. that would be terrific. I'm going to start with a question for our panelists and perhaps invite Dan to share his views first, then Bronwyn, and then Pradeep. We find ourselves at the moment having to balance a great retreat to nationalism, while at the same time recognizing that we need to also engage with international markets, because we absolutely cannot become self-sufficient in every aspect of every industry. And perhaps there's no sector which is more challenged in respect of maintaining this balance between ensuring supply chain resilience versus engaging with international markets than the healthcare sector. Dan, if you could share your views on how we can bring a pragmatic approach to ensuring that, yes, we do need some greater self-sufficiency, but at the same time, we need to also focus on these opportunities with India and Indonesia and other markets in the region, as I know MTP Connect has been very involved with.
Thanks, Mukund. Look, that's a really interesting question. You know, how do we develop sovereign capabilities at the same time as manage our relationships with all of our countries who are close by and our export markets and whatnot. I think COVID-19, you know, Bronwyn touched on COVID-19, as did Mukund. You know, it's had a huge impact on the sector. I think if you watch this space over the next week or so, we'll release a report that we're developing, which looks at how the MTP sector has responded to COVID-19 and how it's been impacted. And clearly one of the things that's happened is that the establishment of the task forces at a federal level to coordinate industry and to have industry help coordinate securing ventilators, PPE, testing kits, diagnostics, that whole space has demonstrated how important industry is in times of national health emergencies, pandemics. It has flagged the need for sovereign capability, the need for supply chain resilience, and we've seen companies pivot to do new things, and Epichem in WA, for example, has pivoted to make hand sanitizer, which is really good. But as companies pivot and they start to look at these other opportunities, they also have to have existing markets or ongoing markets. And I think that's where the real opportunity for Asia is, that as we start to see companies who have pivoted to produce things, we don't just have to be producing for Australia. We need to be thinking about exporting to our neighbors in Asia. And so I think we can have both. We can work to make sure that we improve our sovereign capabilities around key components. We can work with our neighbors. They will need access to the products that we make. Our companies will need access to those markets, because you can't necessarily build a manufacturing sector without markets beyond the Australian shores. And so I think there is a mechanism to do that. I think Asia will play a key role, and we have to continue to focus on building those relationships. We also have to build those relationships again for supply chain resilience, because we won't necessarily manufacture or have all of the raw materials needed to do the manufacturing that we might want to do. So we're really quite positive about the potential for, you know, the recovery coming out of COVID-19 to be in part driven by the MTP sector. We think that there's great opportunities. It will require our industry pivoting and doing new things in a new way, but it'll also involve continuing to build those relationships with our partners in Asia, our partners around the world, and making sure that we continue to grow exports. I'll stop by just flagging that the MTP sector is a significant exporter in Australia, with $8.2 billion of exports in 2019. That made it the 8th largest export sector in Australia. And so we have an opportunity to grow that. And I think we need to manage that very carefully over the next 6 to 12 months as we recover from the impact that COVID-19 has brought to our medtech, biotech, and pharma sector.
Bronwyn and Pradeep, any comments from you on how we manage and balance this tension?
I think Dan covered it pretty well. I think there's a very big focus on sovereign capability at the moment, but if you looked at the comments made by Karen Andrews, but also Scott Morrison in his headline speech, you would see that they are softening that with a focus on remembering that we are a trading nation. I was on a round table with Karen Andrews, and she reiterated that many times. And I think, you know, the reality is there are lots of ways of protecting and building a resilient future, and not all of that means, that doesn't necessarily mean make everything here. It means if we don't make it here, have sufficient stocks and appropriate arrangements that we don't get blocked out of global supply chains as a relatively small nation. Doesn't mean we have to make everything here. So just reiterating what Dan says, I think moving forward there's an interesting opportunity in disrupting the way we're all doing things. The fact that I'm not in Perth today, much as my mother and my family who live there would love me to have come to Perth for this event, the fact that I'm doing this from home in the Macedon Ranges really illustrates that we're all learning quickly how to do things differently. And, you know, when it comes to international business, that actually makes things easier. If we don't have to get on a plane every time we want to build that relationship, every time we want to progress that deal, arguably we can do more international business now than we have been previously, when traditional engagement methods have required that face-to-face contact. And it's kind of been the great equalizer, because everyone has to do it. No one can travel. It's not like it's just Australia or just New Zealand or just America. Everyone's in the same boat. And I don't think, at least in my lifetime, I can recall another situation that's forced everyone to engage differently. So, I mean, COVID's been a big shock, but I think we can come out of it stronger. And I think international business is one area where we can totally expand. And, you know, for many of our SMEs, the international travel that they need to do is a massive burden on their cash flow. So if we can find other ways to find them international partners and to broaden their markets and to partner without that travel budget, we could see an acceleration of globalization, but just delivered a different way.
Look, and I think Pharma makes a really good point. You know, first of all, Australia is a small open economy. It requires trade and it requires immigration. That's the first point. And these have been unambiguously good for Australia. The second is there's an irony here. You know, people are using the pandemic as an excuse to accelerate this trend that had already existed towards greater nationalism. The irony is this, that the solution to the pandemic is actually global. You have to actually solve this globally if everyone is to benefit or anyone is to benefit. The third point I'd make is that globalization has been unambiguously good for all of us on this planet, in terms of knowledge flows, in terms of cultural understanding, in terms of things like the alleviation of poverty, in terms of building depth in financial markets to drive growth. So these things have been unambiguously good. And finally, if we think about the health sector by and large solves global universal problems. And so for us in the health sector, globalization is more important, more fruitful, more critical than this trend that we see towards greater nationalism. Particularly as we're talking here about the innovation that comes to the health sector. You cannot put the innovation and technology need back in the bottle by putting up your borders. To do so would be to consign ourselves to lower growth and a lower quality and standard of life.
Thanks, Pradeep, Brown and Dan. Very powerful comments there, and very balanced, and a real push there for globalization at the end. I'd like to just build on that with an application of that question now at a firm level. We have a terrific question that's come in, which is about the manufacturing of isolation gowns. And the question is whether this form of personal protective equipment should be manufactured in Australia, even if the cost is higher. So, Dan, with your MTP Connect CEO hat on, if you were speaking to a firm that was manufacturing these gowns here in Australia and is hearing a lot of this talk here in Australia about sovereign capability, domestic supply chain resilience, the need to actually supply to the domestic market, but you've actually got your own P&L to manage, you've got limited capital, and you're looking at the best place to manufacture. what advice would you provide if the cost of manufacturing in Australia is actually higher?
Look, that's always going to be a challenge, isn't it? What I was trying to highlight in my previous comment is that, if we're going to pivot to manufacturing things, we have to do that in a commercially sensible way. People have to have markets that they can sell into. I don't think that we can create industries that are just going to service the national stockpile or the current COVID crisis. I think that we have to think about how we create industries that can generate products that, to Pradeep's point, can be exported, that have a global focus. And I think that probably the way that Australia can move is to think more about developing manufacturing capabilities that are pivotable. If you think about Flex or Flextronic in California, Silicon Valley, facility that one day is manufacturing running shoes and the next day can be making automated beer making machines that sit on your kitchen bench, and in another part of the factory they're printing circuit boards, and so they sort of pivot to what needs to be made. So maybe there's an opportunity in Australia to think more broadly around manufacturing capabilities in general that can move from one opportunity to another. But at the end of the day, if companies can't find a market for their product, then they're not going to be sustainable, and that's the real challenge. In times of pandemic, industry has really stepped up, and I really want to emphasize that. Large and small industry has stepped up, often at a significant cost to themselves, to help meet the national and state needs in this time of crisis. And I think that's a fantastic outcome for Australia. But we also have to make sure that when they've done that there are opportunities down the track to keep those companies going.
Mukund, could I make one comment? And that is this: we don't live in crisis all the time, and we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that we can control for every risk in every moment. I think the key to this is a better frame for thinking about the question that was asked is, how can we have an environment in this country where we can talk openly about the risks, that we can have an ongoing conversation about them, about how we might prepare for these things, not necessarily control for every one of them. It's a simple insurance question. And the key to the insurance question here is, can we develop something in the Australian mindset which is all about problem solving? Because if we do, then it means that whatever the circumstances as they arise, which we cannot always predict, that we will be agile enough to solve some of these problems at home.
And Mukund, I might just say that I think during this COVID crisis, our industry sector in particular has demonstrated that they are agile enough to respond when needed. And again, I can't emphasize the fact that we've had small manufacturers switch from manufacturing gin to making hand sanitizer. We've got Epichem doing hand sanitizers. We've got companies making ventilators. We've got companies that were making plastic parts for other things have switched to making plastic parts for medical devices. And I think we have that capability, but indeed Pradeep is right. We need to build that mindset.
I think Mukund, just jumping on, Pradeep said something that was really profound, which is you can't mitigate every risk. And if COVID-19 has taught us one thing, it is there are risks that happen that you could never foresee. In terms of, and Dan and I had a conversation the other day, how do we make our offices that were perfectly functional and amazing that we both signed up to late last year suddenly fit a post-COVID environment requirement from a regulatory perspective? There are just risks that you can never mitigate. So I think the part about that is being agile and being opportunistic. To Dan's point, gin manufacturers making hand sanitizer, which makes me deeply sad in one way, but very happy in another. But there are so many opportunities for Australia as a small nation that can quickly pilot things to pivot to take advantage of those types of occurrences when the risk happens that we couldn't foresee.
Thanks, Brandon. Sanitizer and tonic doesn't have the same ring, does it, as gin and tonic anyway? Terrific responses and really helpful, and it's incredibly important for our participants who are running small and medium-sized medtech and pharma companies attending the session to actually recognize the level of agility that this current environment needs to show that they need to show in this current environment, but also to see it as an opportunity, which is how you framed it, which is absolutely terrific. I'd like to ask a question now, first to Pradeep, and then invite Brandon and Dan if you've got some views on this as well. Dan presented in his slides, Pradeep, on the IHEPA benefits, specifically around data localization and source code benefits, which are terrific outcomes to have because there have been long-standing concerns for Australian companies looking to do business in Indonesia. And so they're great outcomes for technology companies to now have. This question now is in the context of India, where we've obviously had over a period of time a desire to conclude a free trade agreement with India. And India has also, of course, highlighted its interest, its lack of interest now, should I say, in RCEP as well. And one of the questions that's come in from our participants is about the high level of import duties in India, in a sense that therefore in Australia's trade with India, China has an unfair advantage over India because of obviously CHAFTA compared to the lack of a free trade agreement. So you spoke about Peter Varghese' excellent report, which is a terrific bilateral strategy and provides the narrative, the set of opportunities, the measure of success. But what about the actual cost of doing business with India, given that the import duties, the customs duties, the tax are incredibly high?
You know, we have, I think, been pretty lazy about our relationship with India for a long time. You know, I will scream the next time someone uses the 3 C's to describe Australia and India: Commonwealth, curry, and cricket. Right? But it also reflects the sad reality. The depth of our relationship has not really developed over a period of time. Our engagement with China has been much more significant through periods of time. Now, that's not all of Australia's fault. India, for a large part of its history in the last century, you know, as leader of the non-alignment movement, kept to itself a lot. But India, over the last 20 years, has shifted her posture dramatically. And I think we've been slow on the uptake. I don't think we have picked the pivotal moment of change in India. And so Australia's business relationship with India has been really poor. If we look at our investment relationship, right, Australian companies do not invest significantly at all in India. And our trade, while it has grown, it's all pretty basic sort of traditional trade composition. So I think there is an important part of answering this question: why, you know, and when will these import duties be lifted? Well, that depends, and it depends on us making sure that we value this relationship and are able to establish good trade and investment relationships with India, and then we will see the shift. But in doing so, we have to remember one thing: that India is carving out its future for itself. It is not waiting for Australia. It is not waiting for other people. And India's growth rate and its potential tells us that it is actually in our interest to jump on the Indian bandwagon rather than expect them to look to us. And I think you're seeing this play out in India's posture with respect to tariffs, but also respect to RCEP. And I think we have to be serious about this going forward.
So Pradeep, in the next 3 to 5 years, we can't expect to have any change in the relationship from an FTA perspective and a reduction in tariffs?
Not necessarily, because I think one of the things India is carving out its posture globally, and I think there is a lot to be gained by really quickly. We know the PM and Prime Minister Modi are about to have their conversation in the next week or two, which is going to be significant. We can make big inroads if we develop that close relationship right now. And I think relationships can shift things like positions on tariffs, alliances in international fora, and I think that is possible for us over the next 3 to 5 years, whether we have an FTA or not, for the dividends of growth from greater trade between both countries to come through.
Thank you, Pradeep. That's very helpful. Thank you for that. If I could now shift to a couple of key comments that Brownman and Dan made in their presentations, and invite contributions from them and also from Pradeep. And there's a specific comment that Brownman made which was very powerful, and I would love for this comment to be made more often in presentations when we speak about Asian markets. And Brownman's comment was that her engagement with the region, and also in reading the report on Indonesia, led her to think, especially through engaging with Halodoc, what can we learn from Indonesia? And it's not a question that I feel enough Australian business executives and policymakers ask. We're often very focused on offering the solutions, but it appears that they also have solutions that can actually lift the quality of our life and also lift the quality of prosperity in Australia. So Brownman, could you share a little bit, building on the Halodoc example, building on the very specific areas that you've highlighted that are coming out of COVID-19, that you think that we could partner with the region for them to actually support us?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm always worried when somebody says that I've made a profound statement. So I think it's kind of interesting, really, because Halodoc's such a world leader. You know, they have attention from international investment houses, and really impressive company. And there was a number of companies. We hosted 45 executives from an ASEAN, I think it was 45 delegation that year. And in digital health, because actually Australia has been quite slow on the uptake. So the way we define digital health, and the massive focus on telehealth during COVID, where other countries like Indonesia, because they have had to be more efficient, have been deploying those technologies for some years. Remote patient monitoring, a lot of this stuff is actually already in use in developing nations and other partner nations across Asia through necessity, and we've kind of been a bit slow because we've been quite comfortable. And absolutely, there's massive learnings when we bring in these companies and work with these companies from offshore that we can deploy. And we talk a lot about all the barriers to getting stuff done, the realities of deploying standardized telehealth platforms that meet certain criteria and all of these things. But realistically, those challenges have been overcome in other countries, and Halodoc's just a great example of that. So I too have, I guess, through my 20-year career, have done a lot of work on international delegations, inbound and outbound, and we often do talk about what we've got to offer to nations. And I think Australia and Australians do well to maybe be a little bit more humble and say, what can we learn? And definitely in this space, because we have been bluntly a little bit slower on the uptake across certain aspects of digital health, we have a lot to learn from countries which have deployed it through, if for no other reason, economic necessity, whereas we've never had the same driver, I don't think, in the same way. But also the way that companies in those countries have made profitable businesses out of environments where the average spend is a lot lower than it is here. So that would indicate that the opportunity here is significantly larger. But we don't necessarily do those case studies. We look to other more familiar markets like the US and the UK. And I mean, we're guilty of that in our case studies. We have a lot of data on US and UK companies and not many on Asian companies, which is something we're working on at the moment. But I just think it's just worth our while to remember that we don't have all the answers and that the answers are found everywhere.
Thanks, Brandon. That's really helpful. And it's a good point about case studies and the breadth of case studies that we typically have of comparable Western markets compared to Asian markets, which is what this report was looking to address in addition to the narrative. So there are lots of case studies in both of the reports that Dan presented too. Can I invite Pradeep and then Dan to speak about what we can also learn from India given the many case studies in that report of US and companies from other parts of the world actually undertaking at scale manufacturing in India.
Mukund, just to reiterate one of those points that goes to what Bronwyn just said. Complacency is our killer. And one of the things you learn from those where necessity drives innovation, complacency goes out the back door. And so that is one of the big differences, I think, culturally between us and India and Indonesia. The second is this mindset from a business point of view. India and Indonesia don't need us, per se. At least they don't need us to go in with that attitude. We actually need Indonesia and India as much as they need us. And if we think about, the whole innovation, digital health, medtech kind of space, and the topic we started out here this afternoon, frugal innovation. What we see is how we sometimes think of digital health and innovation in more and more sophisticated terms. Whereas India and Indonesia are solving for a problem where they've already got poverty, they've got poor infrastructure in some ways, they've got geography, and they're using things like digital health as enablers, stripping back the bells and whistles to bring price down without compromising on quality, by driving access, thinking about how do people get access and how do they use it, and thinking about what we would consider those overlooked consumers and the problems they face. And I think these are some of the lessons that we can learn, particularly in the medtech and digital health space, when we look at Indonesia and India.
Thanks, Pradeep. The point on complacency is an extraordinarily important point for Australian businesses in particular to take into consideration as they look at the Indian market. Dan, any comments from you on this point in terms of what we can learn?
I think that both Pradeep and Bronwyn have probably covered that topic pretty well. We do need to look to other countries and the way they do things. I think the classic example, the first time I really thought about it was when I was in Hong Kong, and we were talking about equitable access to healthcare and the challenges that Australia has because of its regional and remote communities, huge landmass. And at that time, somebody pointed across the street and just said, well, in that high-rise building across the street, we have the same problem of providing equitable access to healthcare. It's just not as a result of distance, but as a result of population or other factors. And so there's a great amount of information and a lot of learnings that can be taken from how countries are providing access to their patients in small countries, but overcoming that access issue. I think the other thing I'd like to say is that if we go back to how we've responded to COVID and we've become agile, there are a lot of countries that are very agile without having to have a health crisis. And I think we need to make sure that we don't fall back into that complacent sort of behavior of not being agile. And examples of things that we've done differently now that other countries have probably been doing more than we have, simple things like accepting electronic signatures on documents for clinical trials has been something that's talked about for forever in the sector. And it was only because of COVID that the sector sort of took that step. And I think there are learnings of the way countries are doing things, their business practices, their manufacturing practices, and the businesses and devices, opportunities that they have. We can learn from that. I think we have to do that. We just can't go back to doing things the way we were 3 months ago.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Bronwyn, and thanks, Pradeep, for those insights. Really very powerful. Lot there to actually reflect on, which is what it appears our participants are doing. As we've got a terrific question from one of the participants after reflecting on your earlier comments as a panel on being agile and pivoting. And the question that's come in is one that recognizes that actually pivoting may not always be possible and may not be possible on all items of PPE, as it needs plant and equipment investments. And there's a point here being made about gloves. For instance, what happens when a country like Malaysia produces 68% of all the rubber, latex, and nitrile gloves? There are numbers as high as 80% of the inspection gloves being produced by Malaysia. And the question is, should a country hold such a high market share? Dan, perhaps this is one for you, and then the other panelists.
Well, I guess should a country hold that market share? Well, I guess our economy has driven us to that situation where countries have become very efficient at producing materials and goods and have captured the market. So I guess that is a challenge. I think one of the things that has come out in the country's response to COVID is indeed securing supply chains in times of challenges. And I think that touches on Pradeep's comment about the critical importance of building relationships and maintaining relationships with countries in the area to ensure that we have access to it. We will never be completely self-sufficient in everything, as Bronwyn's pointed out and others have pointed out. So I think it's, that relationship building activity that Pradeep talked about is really critical.
Thanks, Dan. Perhaps if I can build on that, you spoke about the many task forces and committees that have been established over the last few months in responding to the pandemic, and connecting the work of those many task forces and committees to this question from our participant, which you've just responded to. Did you find through your work through those committees and task forces that there was a mapping of the market share held by countries around the world in specific areas of, equipment, ventilators, testing kits, and in PPE, and perhaps the areas in which we needed to invest and make strategic bets to establish manufacturing in Australia?
Thanks, Mukund. Look, I don't know if there was a mapping of market share, but there was clearly a very collaborative approach with industry, government, both state and federal, to look at the needs of Australia in terms of PPE, ventilators, ICU equipment, diagnostics, and other medical devices, and then to work very closely together to find supplies for Australia. And again, that was, I think huge thanks goes out to industry, to government, and the sector for really working together to do that. I think it has highlighted where there were challenges in terms of accessing the material that we needed to address the pandemic. I think the industry responded well. Examples of Gray Innovation and others producing ventilators is a great example of being able to pivot. It doesn't really address the question of whether or not there's too much concentration in other countries. But again, I think that the economy, the market will drive that, has driven that. We need to find ways to make sure that we secure our supply chains, that they're resilient, and we do that by building the relationships.
Pradeep and Bronwyn, your thoughts on that? Should we be making strategic bets?
Auckland, the key to this, I'll go back to something I'd mentioned earlier, is we need, because we can't solve for every problem, we need to have an innovation mindset in business and in every industry, in every sector that we have. And this goes to not just a moment in time in the middle of a crisis. The only way you manage crises, and we've seen we handled this pretty well because there were business people, there were people in the medical profession, etc., who were able to bring their experience and expertise to the fore in new and interesting ways to find solutions. Now, the risk for us is that this is quite by accident that that's occurred. Unless we have a good conversation in our country around the way we drive innovation in business, in our education system, and every sector, I think when the next crisis comes, we might find that we're not as capable of being able to find, to rally together and find a solution. So the key lesson out of COVID-19 is that you actually have to work hard to be able to build the capability and capacity to be able to innovate and pivot, not just retreat to what I think might be a simplistic answer, let's bring all our supply chains back home.
Yeah, so I agree with Pradeep that you could take a very, binary, let's bring it all at home and make everything here perspective, but I think it's unrealistic in the long term. I think about strategic bets, it kind of has that, touch of picking winners that we've done before. I think Andrew Stevens from Innovation and Science Australia made a great point in an article recently about looking for areas where we have competitive and comparative advantage. And clearly the sectors being discussed here around Medtech, Pharma and digital health are areas where in Medtech and Pharma we have traditional strengths and a world-leading position. And we've been a top 5 kind of centre for that for a long time. And digital health is the emerging kind of third pillar of those sectors as we look across the health technology sectors. So I definitely think that there are areas where we can see strategic advantage. Karen Andrews and Greg kind of both commented on the need for science and technology skills to underpin the industries of the future and applying them across areas. So not just our space clearly, but food and agriculture and space is quite in at the moment. So I really do think that we can look at strategic opportunities and we can try to pick winners. But I think my caution with that is always that policymakers should not necessarily be the people to pick winners. It should be industry. And so the people who have the experience of taking those things to market should be driving the discourse about where those advantages lie. But again, going back to the points of Dan and Pradeep, this is not about becoming an isolated island. We can, but that's not the way forward. The way forward is working in a way with our partners to find where skills and capabilities are complementary, and working really hard to ensure those relationships are in place so that we can efficiently grow and also focus the areas where we have areas of competitive advantage.
And Mukund, I would agree with Bronwyn that it is about competitive advantage. I think that based on competitive advantage, we should be picking winners or trying to pick winners based on where we have that competitive advantage. I think we do have to be innovative. I think we have to think about, how this, this last 3 months has perhaps created opportunities to build industries, but they have to be competitive and they do have to have markets. And I can't remember who said it, but they're global markets. We're not going to build industries just for the Australian market. So I think there are activities where we have great competitive advantage. We need to leverage that. We need to build on it.
Mukund, if I could make one comment here. A lot of people make the case, actually, let's bring these supply chains home, let's build up all our manufacturing capability, etc. And there are things we should be doing differently to what we've done before. We need to think about economic development and industrial development differently to the way we thought about before. But the arguments I think that Dan, Bronwyn and I are putting forward here, one thing I want to make clear is that none of these things are easy or cheap or anything like that. They require investment of ourselves in our mindset, but also investment in the way the country moves forward. Because innovation and all this don't just happen in a vacuum. And so if you look at kind of the work that Bronwyn does, she helps people navigate the uncertainties of starting their business in the area of digital health. Right? I work with people in the medtech field who require certain kind of disciplines to get going. If you look at what Dan does through MTP Connect, they're all about empowering those who provide infrastructure in the system that allows entrepreneurs and people with ideas to take them from idea to commercialization to market. And I think that's a really important mindset that we've got to have in Australia if we want to confront crises again in the future.
Mukund, we've talked a lot about products, digital health products, Medtech products, pharma products, but we haven't really touched on the fact that Australia has great potential around service exports in this space as well. And the one that I think really resonates with WA is clinical trials and the importance of the clinical trials sector. That is a significant service export to, and it brings in somewhere in the order of $1 billion a year into industry-sponsored clinical trials. And I think there are other examples of service exports that we need to be making sure that we are supporting. The other one that comes to mind is international students and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the university sector, and indirectly the impact it will have on Australia's competitive advantage in terms of the medical research that we undertake, because those students, the fees they pay help support the research that's done in our universities, that helps lead to the spin-out companies and the commercial opportunities that we'll see that leads to patient outcomes. So I think we do have to focus not just on opportunities and challenges as they relate to products and devices, but also making sure that we focus at least in part on the service exports that our sector has.
That's very helpful, Dan, in terms of not forgetting the opportunities from the services perspective, particularly from an international education perspective, and the way in which that obviously links in this case to medical research as well. Incredibly important. So thank you for those insights from you and from Pradeep and from Bronwyn as well. I have a great question that's come in, which is about the role of local government. Obviously, a lot of effort often goes in terms of the role of our policymakers at the federal level at a time like this, the task forces and committees that, for instance, Dan referred to, and also the role of the state government in administering its economy through a period such as this. But what role can local government play in supporting medtech and pharma companies pursue and capture the opportunities in markets like India and Indonesia as described in these two reports?
Well, first point would be this, that in the end, success comes from the people who generate the ideas. And so if you take local government, the closest point of government in Australia to where people are. The level of government which best understands the talent and the infrastructure and the types of problems that are needing to be solved. And so there is a role here for local government, not to mandate, but to encourage, to facilitate the development of human capital and innovation in a way that maximizes the probability of success. And I think there is incredible assets that reside in our communities, physical and people, and bringing these together. One of the things about WA, for instance, I think its natural strength is biodiversity. And this is an area where we need to explore in greater, I think, when we think about medtech and pharma going forward. So I think there is an incredibly important role for local government in particular, but often left out of the discussion when we think about innovation.
I will probably take a more cynical view. So if we look at COVID, we've seen some of the bigger local governments, predominantly around capital cities, take some really great steps to support their economies and their ecosystems. But at a broader level, at least what I've seen over here on the other side of the country, I've seen very little engagement by local government in responding to COVID. And we don't see a huge amount of, outside of those big cities, local government getting engaged necessarily in innovation policy. Some of the bigger regional centres do, specifically in collaboration with universities. I think it's a lost opportunity. I think local government has a crisis of relevance in terms of becoming part of that conversation. And I think it would be great to see local government get involved. I think there's a massive opportunity. I can't speak to WA. It's 20 years since I've lived in WA. You guys have a lot stronger kind of regional sense, like a stronger regional sense across the regions in WA is my experience. But I think local government potentially should be using the current climate as an opportunity to re-engage in the role they play in building their local economies, especially as workforces become more geographically distributed. But at least on this side of the Nullarbor, I've not seen, beyond the big city centres, huge amounts of local government response or support for those trying to build companies.
I might just call out the City of Perth and the efforts that they've put to promote the medtech and biotech sector in Perth, and the support that they gave to the Western Australian delegation to BioKorea, the virtual partnering conference that just happened. I think there are opportunities for local governments to support their sector, if nothing more through supporting trade missions delegations, attending things like BioKorea, BioJapan, Bio in the US, helping local companies get access to those types of events and trade missions.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Bronwyn. Thanks, Pradeep. I'm conscious of time, and so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to wrap up this in-conversation discussion and this event. And in doing so, I want to start by thanking the City of Perth for their leadership, which builds on the comments we've just heard. Really terrific leadership over a long period of time to support Perth-based businesses to engage with international markets, and great to see the focus, Steve, that you and your team have, in particular on the medtech and pharma sector. So thank you for your support of Asialink Business as well. Can I thank our three speakers, and Dan and Bronwyn and Pradeep, for their excellent insights. Dan, thank you for your exceptional presentation, which reflects the major findings and recommendations on both the India and Indonesia reports, which I want to highlight again are publicly available through the websites of both MTP Connect and Asialink Business. Bronwyn, thanks for expanding the definition for us to include, in addition to digital health, digital therapeutics and digital medicine as we think about opportunities in our region. And thank you for also reminding us using HelloDoc as a very powerful example of the need for us to also learn of business models that we can bring to our own market. And then finally, thank you to Pradeep for reminding us of the need to take a long-term approach with India, which is one that needs to avoid complacency, and also the need to understand India for its own structure and priorities, especially when we look at it from the perspective of free trade, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, in terms of our engagement with that market. So thank you to our three speakers. Thank you to all of you as participants who have joined this session. If I could request for you to please complete the survey that will be available at the end of this event. It'll also be emailed to you. That would be terrific. And can I please also invite you to join future events hosted by Asialink Business, details of which are available on our website, asialinkbusiness.com.au. Thank you so much to all of you again for participating. Thank you again to the City of Perth and to our speakers. Have a lovely afternoon and evening.